think, Marge. All I need is a title.
We have to begin the 8th episode of Atheist Bible Studies with an overview of what we've learned in the first 7 episodes of the series. We learned that the founding story for the guilt trip at the center of Christianity, the sin of Adam and the so-called fall of man, were myths lifted from other cultures. We also learned that there is no historical, archaeological, or paleological evidence supporting the existence of Adam, Eve, Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, or any of his brothers. A good number of people have done research that indicates that the Great Flood of Noah never happened, and that the story was based on a Babylonian fable referring to a flood of the Iraqi floodplain. Further, the story of the Tower of Babel was written not by Moses, a man inspired by God to write about historical events, but rather by aggrieved Semite intellectuals who quite understandably wrote a tale about how their God could smite the heathens who were trying to build a 7-story ziggurat. With all these flaws in the book of Genesis, one might wonder, why continue into the book of Exodus? After all, if Genesis did not happen as it was written, then the foundation of Christianity disappears because there is nothing for the biblical Jesus to suffer and die for. And in fact, there could not have been a biblical Jesus because he descended from Abraham, who we've shown never existed. The thing is, where the book of Genesis is laughably flawed, the book of Exodus tops it, because all of the events in the book are made up out of whole cloth, with the main character who is a conglomeration of other characters from history. A far-fetched situation of millions of people being kept as slaves in a country where they outnumbered their captors, God being portrayed as a complete show-off, punishing Pharaoh and the Egyptian people, then hardening Pharaoh's heart so that he could continue pulling more stunts. The story continues with a display of laws taken from other cultures where they are not simply common sense or cultural norms of the real writers of the book. And in the end, God punishes the Semites by forcing them to wander around in the deserts of the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years, rather than figuring out something else and allowing the people to simply walk the shortest distance out of Egypt, which would have taken them roughly 2 weeks. When you think about the story of the book of Exodus, you probably think about something like this.
It is not forbidden to look upon the breath of pestilence, then see, for it is here.
Do not look, Eleazar. Close the door, Joshua, and let death pass.
The Ten Commandments was a very well-produced and famous movie released in 1956, and it portrays the biblical events in the book of Exodus quite well. This scene of the spirit of death creeping over the land used to scare the crap out of me as a young child, and in fact, the movie is a very good tool to use in pushing the biblical propaganda message that God is great, that Pharaoh and Egypt were a bunch of fools, and that all of these things happened, and that God severely disapproved of slavery and the treatment of his people, except that during and after the Exodus, God tormented his people and gave them exact rules on how, where, and when to buy and sell slaves and how to treat them. The whoppers started at the beginning of the book. Exodus 1:7 states that the population of Hebrews in the district of Goshen, basically a county in Egypt, became, quote, so numerous that the land was filled with them. Later, in Exodus 12:37, and again in Numbers 11:21, the Bible states that the number of males leaving Egypt was 600,000 men. Now, most people would assume that the number represents only about half the population, the other half, of course, being the women. So we might add an estimated 600,000 women as well. Let's be conservative with the next number and say that only 25% of the married couples had one child, which would add another 125,000 possible people, for an estimated total of 1.325 million people. That's basically the equivalent to the population of San Diego, California. Estimates for the population of Egyptians living in the country at the time were between 2 and 4 million people. So if we use these numbers, between 20 and 33% of the population were supposedly slaves. That might be possible, but the problem in the Bible story is that all these people were in one district of the country, not spread out across it. With that in mind, there is no way that the Hebrews were slaves in Egypt, as they outnumbered the local population of their so-called oppressors. The book of Exodus even states that this was the reason that Pharaoh was worried about the situation, and why he ordered the deaths of any male Hebrew infants in Exodus 1:16 and again in Exodus 1:22. But the order was not carried out, and the Hebrews only grew larger in population. Because of this edict, Moses is abandoned by his mother, who puts the infant in a reed boat and sets him adrift on the Nile River. The story is very similar to the story of Sargon of Assyria, whose autobiographical account states that he was sealed up in a reed boat lined with bitumen and set adrift on the Euphrates River. He was later recovered by a water drawer and grew up amongst a man's gardens. Please note that we have encountered the substance known as bitumen before. It was the substance used as mortar for the bricks used in the construction at Babylon, as detailed in Atheist Bible Studies number 5. The movie puts a lot of details into the life of Moses as he was becoming an adult at the court of Egypt. Under the reign of Seti, Moses conquers Ethiopia and sends a large number of barges down the Nile filled with treasure. The movie builds up a rivalry between Moses and Pharaoh's own son, Ramses, and it embellishes quite a bit on Moses killing an Egyptian and the surrounding situation. The movie makes a great deal out of Moses finding out about his heritage, where the Bible infers that he knows that he's Hebrew-born.
Will you swear in the name of this God that you are not my mother?
We do not even know his name.
And look into my eyes and tell me you are not my mother.
Oh, Moses, Moses, I cannot.
I am your brother Aaron.
I'm Miriam, your sister.
In both the movie and the Bible, Moses grew up in the court of Pharaoh, which becomes important later. While the movie fills in a lot of the backstory, fully showing the oppression of the slavery that the Hebrews were supposedly enduring, and plays up the rivalry between Moses and Ramses, the Bible really does none of this. In fact, Moses is born at the beginning of the 2nd chapter of Exodus, and he kills an Egyptian and flees the country by the end of that chapter. We have to congratulate the Bible for its brevity here. It is slightly interesting that in the book of Genesis, God appears to people in the flesh, as it were, but in the next book, God appears to Moses on a volcano-like mountain as a fiery bush that does not burn.
Tonight he is awake. am here. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground.
Of course, at this point, God says he has heard of the plight of the Hebrews and sends Moses to bring them out of Egypt so that they can be gathered at Mount Sinai and become his people. He explains to Moses that he is to do several tricks designed to show God's power, but God will harden Pharaoh's heart against letting the Hebrews leave the country. This is where God again shows his thuggish colors. If God is all-knowing, then he would have known this situation in Egypt, where the Hebrews had grown to make up a sizable chunk of the population. And for them to simply get up and leave would do significant damage to the country. This is why Pharaoh didn't want to let the Hebrews go, and Exodus explains this. When Moses approaches Pharaoh and states that God demands that the Hebrews be released, Pharaoh replies that he does not know the God of the Hebrews and will not let them go.
The slaves are mine. Their lives are mine. All that they own is mine. I do not know your God, nor will I let Israel go.
Who are you to make their lives bitter in hard bondage? Man shall be ruled by law, not by the will of other men.
Who is this God that I should let your people go?
What happens next is the second problem with this part of the story. From Exodus 7 through Exodus 12, God unleashes a series of increasingly severe catastrophes on the country of Egypt. Now, each of these events would be enough to cause any sane person to do whatever they could do to get the rest of the events to stop. Moses is simple about this. He tells Pharaoh to let Israel go. Pharaoh says no, but then God also hardens his heart against the Hebrews, so that God can continue to unleash devastation after devastation. Each plague after the first is a punishment on Pharaoh and the people of Egypt, because Pharaoh will not let the Hebrews go, but God is responsible for that. So after destroying the country's crops, livestock, and fish, and after killing every firstborn thing in Egypt, Pharaoh basically orders the Hebrews to leave.
You have conquered, Moses. The foot of a slave is on the neck of Egypt. You are saved from the Nile to be a curse upon me. Your shadow fell between me and my father, between me and my fame, between me and my queen. Your shadow now fills all things with death. Go out from among us, you and your people. I set you free.
It is not by your word, nor by my hand that we are free, Pharaoh. The power of God has freed us.
Enough of your words. Take your people, your cattle, your God, and your pestilence. Take what spoils from Egypt you will, but go.
At this point, what has he got to lose? The country's already been ravaged. However, the spiteful God is not quite done with Egypt yet. As soon after the Hebrews leave Goshen, Pharaoh's heart is hardened again, and he assembles the army to go after them. The Hebrews are caught at the shore of the Red Sea, where God parts the waters, allowing them to pass through on dry land.
The Lord of hosts will do battle for us. Behold his mighty hand.
Pursues, God lets the water come crashing down on them, drowning them.
Chariot! Ah! Run! Run!
Better to serve the Egyptians than to die here.
Who shall withstand the power of God?
Details how this story is a pale imitation of an actual Egyptian story about a pharaoh who takes his naked concubines out onto a lake for some leisure time. While on the lake, one of the women drops a bauble into the water and becomes very upset by this. Seeing this, Pharaoh has his mages fold the water of the lake over so that he is able to retrieve the bauble. A link to the story at Ancient Egypt Online will be put in the comments below. Some quick notes here. God is apparently okay with incest, as at Exodus 6:20, it states that Moses and Aaron were born from an incestuous marriage. People were also still living very long lives compared to modern humans, with Amram, the father of Moses, living to be about 137 years old, which seemed to be about the average lifespan of a person according to Exodus 6. No wonder the Hebrews were breeding like lemmings. They probably had about 60 years of fertility. Anyway, the rest of the book of Exodus is filled with the story of the Hebrews traveling through the desert toward Mount Sinai. Exodus actually explains why they did not go straight along the coastline directly into Canaan, stating that the Hebrews would have moved through the lands controlled by the Philistines, but apparently 600,000 men still would have been beaten by a nation smaller than Egypt. The Philistines inhabited roughly the area known today as the Gaza Strip, but again, the Hebrew men numbered more than the forces used by the United States Armed Forces in the invasion of Iraq in the Persian Gulf War. In Exodus 16, the Hebrews are fed dandruff from heaven. Through their journey through the desert, they are completely at the mercy of needing food and water. When they find water that is undrinkable, or they go hungry, they complain to Moses and bitch that they should have been allowed to die in Egypt. And of course, when Israel goes completely off the rails and outright disobeys God, God acts like a thug and lashes out, killing a few people. But apparently God is still the God of mercy and love. The Hebrews reach Mount Sinai in Exodus 19, and Moses receives the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. We will cover the Ten Commandments in Atheist Bible Studies number 10. More laws are detailed in Exodus 21 through 23. Chapters 25 and 26 deal with the fictional Ark of the Covenant, which in the last few thousand years has only been found by Indiana Jones. Chapters 27 through 30 detail the construction of the temple, the priestly vestments, and the ordination of the priests. Meanwhile, in chapter 32, the Hebrews prove that they have short memories, and think that Moses and apparently God has abandoned them, so they create a golden calf to substitute for God. Of course, God finds out about this and sends Moses down the mountain, where he throws the stone tablets at them and destroys the calf. Most of the rest of the book is consumed with the creation of the second set of tablets, and a repeat of the other laws, the construction of the temple and such. So in summary, the thug God we were introduced to in Genesis is back again in Exodus. The harsh conditions of slavery are used as the excuse to extract the Hebrews from Egypt, after unleashing a number of plagues that devastate the country, to the point basically of destroying the country. Once the Hebrews escaped into the desert, God capriciously killed anyone who did not measure up to his standards. While I admit that replacing the God that brought them out of Egypt with a golden calf after only a few days of Moses' absence was quite stupid on their part, this does not justify the barbaric acts that the Jewish writers of the book of Exodus have their God inflicting on not only the people and rulers of Egypt, but upon his own chosen people. In the next episode of Atheist Bible Studies, we will examine the story of the book of Exodus from a scientific point of view and prove how the entire tale never happened at all. This will build on the evidence against the book of Genesis and the entire Bible overall, as Exodus is the main foundation for the Jewish faith.
You think you're tough, harder than stone. You think you're tough, getting